Final video clip we're going to show is again of Frank Carlo, and this time you're going to see mastery of the hardest objectives of stage 3. Frank Carlo and his mother are going to be involved in a game they created called Word Crash. It's a very simple game where they sit across a table from one another and they choose a word, divide that word in half, and each of them takes half the word. Now, they put their fist like this on the table, one on one side, one on the other, and as they say their half of the word, for example, school bus would be school and bus, they each progress towards the center of the table in a coordinated way. Now, the critical thing here is that if you're going to meet together in the center, you have to be aware of where you are in relationship to the center compared to where your partner is in relationship to the center. It's a whole other level of complexity. So if I've gone too far, and let's say I'm this close to the center and you're over here, I have to pull back, right? Or else we won't meet together and combine our word. Now, what you're going to watch here is how Frank Carlo has mastered this. And you have to be very, very careful to watch those moments because it's happening in very subtle degrees. That's what we want regulation to be, very subtle adaptations. We don't want to wait for big breakdowns to occur because those repairs are much harder. So watch now as we roll this clip. You'll see that Frank Carlo starts out, realizes he's a little bit ahead, and just very subtly pulls back so that they can meet in the middle. And you're going to watch this over several different trials. And each time, watch him take responsibility for coordinating his actions with his mother.
You really, really like Word Crash. Put your hand here. Word Crash. Okay. This. Okay. How about perfect? Oh, wait. Now that's 3 syllables. How about? Let's go back. You say it now. School bus. School bus. School bus. School bus. School bus. Let's do another one. I like that. Okay. Can you think of a word?
We can make the word crash.
Cur. Ash.
Cur.
Ash.
Cur.
Ash.
Cur.
Ash.
Crash.
Boom. Okay, let's try one more. Can you think of a word?
How about dance?
Dan. Ant. Dan. Ant.
D.
Ant.
D.
Ant.
D.
Ant.
Dance.
Da, 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 da.
Now we move to stage 4. And the title of stage 4 is called Variation. And it's actually an introduction to flexible thinking. So we're moving from focusing on coordinated actions to focusing on objectives related to how the child is dealing with information that might be relative, that might vary in predictable amounts and degrees. So we're now going to start setting up activities where we can practice relative information processing. So for example, we're going to do activities where information has a different meaning or value based on what has just come before it. I'll give you an example. Let's say I ask you to model with me beating on this table. Okay, and let's say we're beating on this table in a very soft way. I ask you to do it very softly, so soft you can hardly hear it. Now I ask you to bang a little bit louder. Well, even though I'm using the word louder, you notice that it's still soft. Now that's an example of relative information processing. Someone on the autism spectrum who hadn't learned this would assume that there's just 2 states, soft and loud. And they wouldn't know that louder or a little bit louder is just a relative term. And you'll be seeing a video example of this shortly. We're also going to set up activities that require relative solutions. I'll give you an example of that. Let's say we're trying to figure out the right distance to stand from each other while we're talking. How far apart should we be? Well, if we're whispering like this, the right distance is going to be rather close, isn't it? But if we're shouting, standing at whispering distance will be unpleasant. And the right distance actually is much farther. So what we learned is there is no single right or wrong distance. It depends on other information that's already in the system. Right? The third type of activity we're going to be practicing in stage 3 has to do with what we called earlier, what we called good enough thinking. Good enough problem solving requires that we move away from any absolute definition of being perfect or not perfect. In fact, if we try to be perfect, we're going to wind up failing in the problem. Remember the example I gave you earlier of taking notes. If you focus too much on being perfect in your handwriting and your spelling, you would lose the important information that you were trying to obtain. So therefore, we're going to set up problems where we purposefully make sure that good enough is not defined as perfect. The final type of problem we're going to set up, or activity we're going to do, is one where we're going to practice purposefully making mistakes. Now, I don't know about you, but in my daily life, I don't really have to set up situations where I make mistakes. I make plenty of mistakes already every day, and they're in the hundreds. So the key is that you don't really have to create new mistakes, but what you want to do is to talk about your mistakes in a very brief way, to frame them as normal and expected. It might be something as simple as, oh, made a mistake again. Right? Because what we want to do here is teach the child that the world is not going to be perfect, that when we deal in regulatory information, right, and in dynamic systems, mistakes are part of the price we pay. That if we actually strive for perfection, we wind up creating static systems.